Okay, hi everyone. So hopefully you can all hear me. Thanks to our awesome AV guy. There's a lot of content to go through, so I'm going to go pretty fast. So this is the Web Framework Battle, and after 10 years, I'm again in Italy, in Florence, which is incredible. So thank you to everyone here for coming and joining me in this beautiful city where the lunch is fantastic. I've had some pretty bad conference food over the years, so I never worry about that coming to Italy. Okay, about this talk. I'm going to be comparing web frameworks. The way I'm going to be comparing them makes sense to me. It may not make sense to you, which brings up the question of bias. Because I'm really well known in the Django community. However, my nickname is not Django Daniel. It is PyDanny. I am foremost a Python developer. Well, I also do stuff in other languages, but I care more about Python than I do web frameworks, and I try to reflect that in this talk. However, the truth is I've written a lot about Django. I mean, on my, besides the 5 editions of 2 scoops of Django and maybe one more that's coming, there's also another book, over 200 articles, just tons and tons of stuff. Whereas with FastAPI and Flask and Pyramid, it's a tiny fraction of that. Only Zopenplone comes close, and I haven't touched that in like 13, 14 years. So yeah, so you should have concern about my bias. But what that does tell me is I tend to write about and do more open source on things I'm getting paid to do. So yes, I've written a lot about Django. However, the advantage of the fact that I know so much about Django is that I know the pain points of Django. I know the parts where we're all like, oh my God, why are we using this framework? But I've used Flask since it was launched. It says 12 years, but it should say 13 years. FastAPI I've used for, pretty much within months of it being launched. And I've done a ton of other things for years and years. So I'm not just a Django person. Okay, what frameworks am I covering? I thought about these 5 because these are the ones I have the most experience in within the past 5 years. However, the reality is that as much as Pyramid and Tornado have their strengths, the size of their communities and ecosystem is a tiny, tiny fraction of the other frameworks. So rather than try to sell you or argue points on these other frameworks, as good as they are, we're just going to focus on the big 3, which is Django, FastAPI, and Flask. And one of the things I want to say is, regardless of what I say in this talk, if you're using Flask or FastAPI or Django and I weigh against it, you're not doing anything bad or evil. The Django or FastAPI police aren't going to come after you. You can win in all of these things. And also I have mad respect for the people who work on these projects, who created them and just as importantly, maintained them. So let's jump in. So let's give a quick overview of the frameworks. I'm going to assume everyone has a good understanding, so this will be quick. Django is about 18 years old. It is full stack. It does a ton. It does web serving, databases, HTML. It's got an ORM and form validation built in. It has the admin tool built in, and it is much larger than the other frameworks. FastAPI is 5 years old. It is almost but not quite a micro framework. It does come with data validation built in, thanks to Pydantic, and it uses type annotations to define behaviors. And of course, it is async from the very beginning. And finally, there's Flask, which is 13 years old. It was launched as an April Fool's Day joke. I remember saying, what the heck is this thing going on? And Armin has a sense of humor. It is much closer to being a micro framework. People will argue whether or not Flask is a micro framework. For the purpose of this talk, it is a micro framework. It is, as we all know, or any of you who have done a payment gateway integration or any kind of work with a SaaS vendor, every example is in Flask, pretty much. Maybe it's shifting over to FastAPI, but knowing Flask, even if you're doing Django or FastAPI, is useful just for that. So the things I'm going to compare are developer experience, how What kind of fun do we get to have using it? How fast the framework is, how well it supports asynchronous behaviors, what kind of databases it supports, governance. That means how is the project directed? Who's in charge? What happens if they go away? And sweet spots. These are things where we're like, oh yes, this framework is awesome. So let's start with developer experience, and specifically getting started. So if we try to come up with the tiniest workable code that we can with each one of these frameworks, if you know Django at a deep level, you can make it a single page app. It's not great, but you can do it. And so this isn't even accurate. This won't work, the Django version. Whereas FastAPI and Flask, if you notice, they look really similar. It's super fast to get started, even for beginner Python developers, whereas Django, that's not the case. And then let's get into the documentation. The Django tutorial kind of sucks. And I know that's controversial, but it does. It is the original implementation was good for its time. Was it 18, 19 years later? The world's moved on. And there's no such thing as a quick start in Django. There's no copy-paste code into a single file and it works. FastAPI is easy to get started, but the quick start is a feature list. It is not, hey, this is how you get it running. These are the critical basic tasks that you need. You don't need to really learn anything else. FastAPI is an advertisement. Whereas Flask, oh my God, Flask's is quick start. I know significant projects built basically off the quick start. Sure, they're data science projects and they're doing things more in core Python, but the person who implemented it, they didn't really need to dig into any of the other documentation besides a quick start. It is technically a cheat sheet, except for I guess it's a very long cheat sheet. It is awesome. It is how things should be done. And so I give getting started to Flask. So with this one sub-element, Flask wins. So let's give a hand to Flask. Okay, incoming data validation. This is making sure that a string is a string and not an integer or some other wacky type. And for this, Django and FastAPI are awesome. I love Django Forms. I love Pydantic. I can't decide which one I like more. They both have their advantages. Maybe I lean a little bit more towards FastAPI because of how it uses type hints, but Django has a lot of history for me personally, and I can do crazy things with it. Flask has no built-in validation, and Flask WTF is a great library, but there's absolutely no mention of it in the core docs, which means you need to explore and try to find something, and the documentation doesn't even encourage data validation. They're just like, yeah, do whatever you want, we don't care, which in today's security theater that we live in is a big deal. You can't find evidence anymore because Patreon scraped it out of the universe. But Patreon got hacked about 7-8 years ago pretty hard, and that was because of data validation issues. So yeah, that was one element of many, but if they had had better data validation, that would not have happened. So yeah, did I just duplicate this slide? Yeah, I think I did. Yes, wow, I have a duplicate slide. Sorry about that. Okay, so for this data validation, I'll lean a little bit more towards FastAPI because FastAPI, using types to define behaviors, I believe is going to be easier for people coming into the framework. It's just faster to get up to speed with Pydantic than it is Django Forms. And one could say, well, that's not FastAPI, that's Pydantic, but Pydantic's part of FastAPI. So I'll give FastAPI the slight edge on this. So hands off to... Okay, small projects. These are these little things that we launched that, microservices or whatever. Django I've mixed feelings about. It's great because of the admin and free user modules, but it's overkill if you're doing something with MongoDB or DynamoDB or Firebase or CouchDB or whatever. Django is just not a good fit. And also, if you do want to do one of those single file apps with Django, that's an advanced topic. I don't recommend that for beginning Django people. FastAPI and Flask are both really good. Where I give, because one-file apps are easy, the flexibility of databases is a virtue. Where FastAPI wins is on the validation that Flask lasts. And of course, the built-in REST API is epic, that I don't need to learn a library. As I'm learning FastAPI, I'm building out a REST API. And I'm sure there are people here who are advocates for GraphQL, but I'm going to ignore that. Because the challenge is the same for FastAPI or Flask. So I'll give this one to FastAPI. So, okay, all right. Large projects. Projects eventually, or by design, might start out big or might grow large in size. Django cleans up here. The app structure forced by the framework works. We know this works because there's examples of Sentry and let's see, there's Sentry, there's Instagram, there's Pinterest before they converted over to Flask. There is other applications. I mean, Octopus Energy is another very large Django project. And even if you go to a service layer approach, the fact that you build things out in components and your service layer has to respect that gives you an architectural foundation. So even if you break from the Django paradigm, if you know what you're doing, I don't advise it otherwise, you still get to take advantage of that in pluggable components. So Flask actually does large projects well. Pinterest and Patreon are good examples of this. The blueprint system is pretty sweet and elegant. I prefer the Django way because in Django you have to use the plugin architecture, the Django apps, whereas Flask, to be honest, besides Patreon and Pinterest and a few others, almost no one seems to use blueprints in my experience. Usually large Flask projects end up being big balls of mud, lots of spaghetti code, just because there's no real architectural consideration, because it's let's just get it out fast, or maybe we'll break it up into small pieces as services. So. And then FastAPI, there's absolutely no guidance provided. And while the framework design encourages separation of concerns, so if you do have experience, not just book learning, but experience with software architecture, you can use that with FastAPI, but the lack of guidelines or real structural components for that, this one is definitely a Django win. So Django wins one. Okay, so overall, for developer experience, if we just count up the points, FastAPI wins it. So overall, the developer experience aggregate is FastAPI. Okay, speed. This one was really a pain to figure out. Because the truth is when it comes to frameworks, usually, not always, the database is the bottleneck, right? And with that, indexing and caching in various ways are the best ways to speed things up. Certainly at Octopus, for us, it is a matter of indexing anytime we hit a performance hit. The other challenge with this is the fact that, excuse me. Okay. All right. So the other thing is that there's many different benchmarking methodologies and the tools can be flawed. And of course, just like this evaluation, people can go into their benchmarking with flawed assumptions or biases. So for example, what often happens is people say, wow, FastAPI and Flask are really fast compared to Django. Well, that's because if you just do FastAPI or Flask with, with Django having the head database and the others don't, of course the smaller frameworks are going to be faster. And if you remove all of the security components, the middleware and the cache processor, the context processors that come with Django, then it turns out that Django without a database is pretty much as fast as Flask or FastAPI. So we do have to take this whole subject with a grain of salt. Okay. but let's go into it anyway, because I'm sure you're curious. So JSON serialization. For this, I looked up on the Tech and Power benchmarks, and it was just a simple hello world JSON serialization that maps, the result to hello world. And by looking at it, it is clear that FastAPI is the fastest, right? And Sebastian Ramirez, great guy, he'll tell you this. And Django actually isn't that bad. Out of, I guess, 600 frameworks, it's only 51 slots behind FastAPI. But what the heck happened to Flask? So what this tells me is that there's a problem with the benchmark. So again, as I said, we have to take any benchmark with a grain of salt, because there's no way, as much as I've done a lot of Django, I can tell you there's no way that Django is faster than Flask in this regard, or that it's like a 90 position difference. All right, let's try different tests. Fortunes. Fortunes it's a bit more complicated. It's like getting Unix cookie cutter messages and, Unix fortune cookie messages, and against a database with 12 rows, and it randomly grabs them, and it sends the last out as a bit of HTML. How will that perform? Let's take a look. And here, I think this is a bit more realistic, that FastAPI and Flask are rather close, and Django is, lagging behind. And to me, I think this is more accurate. However, there's many different ways, as you can see with the secondary image, to run Flask. So even the benchmark can't even agree on what tests it's running. So again, this has so much of a grain of salt. But what I did do eventually, as I'm pouring through these benchmarks, is there is what's called the composite, where they take every possible test and they run it, I don't know, a billion times, and then they provide a composite score. And here, Flask wins, just trailed by Django, just trailed by FastAPI, and Django is further behind. So I feel like this is a more accurate representation of what we should be seeing. Oh my goodness, I need to talk faster, don't I? Okay. So what this tells us is things get lost in the wheels. I'm going to skip over this slide. But what it does tell me is that Flask and FastAPI are approximately the same speed, which kind of matches what I think it should be. But again, maybe I'm biased against Django in this regard. Nevertheless, I'm going to assign this as a tie to Flask and FastAPI. Okay, async support. Why does it matter? WebSockets and blocking I/O for things like file streaming, slow APIs, and tarpits. Ask me later what a tarpit is. I'll explain it to you, and why async can really matter. So here, FastAPI just wins. And it is, unlike Django and Flask, it was designed from the outset to be async friendly. All the framework is async by default, whereas Django, there's been a Herculean effort for 10 years now. Andrew Godwin is a god, but the docs aren't great, and doing async in Django isn't fun. Flask, you can make it work, but the docs kind of suck at it. So this one, I'll just give to FastAPI. Databases, I like to use pretty much every database. I try not to be, I don't like to take sides in anything, and again, I'm skipping really fast for these because I'm getting time signs. I think the frameworks tie. And the reason why is, while Django is great for SQL, and for caching, you can use key value stores. The universality of SQL is so powerful for the Django ecosystem. And even FastAPI and Flask, even though they have decent sized ecosystems, Django is just bigger. And part of it is that unified composite of the app architecture and SQL everywhere. And then FastAPI and Flask, the flexibility is a virtue in its own right. So for that, I'm going to just give it as a tie to all three frameworks. Okay, governance. This is who decides what happens in a framework. So for reference, I've talked to Sebastian. I think everybody has. FastAPI loses here. And the reason is that there's no committee. If Sebastian should have a heart attack after eating too many arepas, which is a Colombian food, when we lose his cool mustache, like the world will go on. Like someone else will pick up the torch and run with it. But there's going to be debate. There may be forks and stuff like that, and a bit of chaos. So because of that, and for some companies this matters, and for some of us it does, I would, again, FastAPI loses. So Django and Flask. Okay, sweet spots. What makes us really happy working with the framework? For me with Django, if I know I'm going to be working on a sizable project and I want a large third-party ecosystem with the built-in admin and easy user registration and the whole HTMX thing, Django is like my sweet spot. So for us at Octopus Energy, we use Django a lot. There's a little bit of FastAPI and Flask usage in certain regions for some auxiliary things, like for handling payments and credit checks where you don't want the data to get into Kraken. But otherwise, it's Django all the way. FastAPI, oh my God, I love building REST APIs, and FastAPI is so brilliant at it. It's great for also the async first and just the elegant feeling I get playing with it. Flask, I really used to like for micro frameworks, but let's face it right now, for me anyway, FastAPI is just better at it. So I'm going to give this one as a tie to Django and FastAPI. Okay, so what do I use on new projects? And I like all three. I like all three frameworks. I'll admit I don't build any new Flask projects. Sorry, Flask. I love you guys, or love you people. And David Lord, who is the current maintainer, incredible guy. Mad respect to him. Brilliant. And the overall design is great. But I think FastAPI is an evolution of that, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can, nevertheless, whatever I feel about Flask, you can win with it. And same with Django and FastAPI, which I like both frameworks. So for me personally, I would give it Django for larger projects and then FastAPI for everything else. However, there can only be one, right? Like this is no holds barred battle. So, so which way am I going to go? Well, it comes down to math. If I look at everything that I listed here, FastAPI simply gets the most points. And yes, am I ducking, like making a hard decision? Absolutely. But anyway, the point is that FastAPI wins. However, FastAPI isn't perfect. And the areas where it can improve, and hopefully for those of you in internet land are listening, having a better quick start, coming up with establishing patterns for large projects, and of course the governance issue. And again, Django and Flask are great. So good job, everyone.
You've been very quick, actually, quicker than we have a few minutes to answer some question.
Sure.
We have some question on Slido, but probably we will have time for some more question. And the first one is the only comment, rather question that I will pass in this session, and please give us 2 scoops of FastAPI.
I've thought about it. All right, so I'm going to announce kind of it's okay if I say anything, Audrey? That's my wife over there and co-author. Okay, I'm just going to do it. So we actually are in contract with a publisher to produce the next edition of 2 Scoops of Django. But it's hard with career and our beautiful daughter, brilliant daughter there, ask her multiplication or division questions. So it's hard enough to come up with the time to do that. And the fact is that Sebastian Ramirez is an awesome writer, and his description of async was so similar to our description of async in 2 Scoops of Django. And he claims, and I trust it, Sebastian, he claims that he didn't like copy and make it better. But the fact is he's a really good writer. I'm not sure there's room for it. Let's do a quick vote. Who thinks there's room for 2 Scoops of FastAPI? Okay, so not quite 50%. Okay, so I'm not so sure about that.
And now for a proper question, how much do you, how much does it really matter to pick the right framework, and does it exist? From your talk, the difference aren't that huge between the three.
So here's the thing. As a person who does Django and is notable for it, I've succeeded really well with Flask for like especially small services. So you can make any of these things work. The question is when you, I believe that when it comes down to it, if you want to figure out which one to use, build a small project in each one of them and use the one that you had the most fun working in, and the one that gives you the least amount of frustration. I think that's a better judge. Maybe I shouldn't say that since I'm giving this talk, but I think that'll be a better judge for your needs and your priorities than me up here. But yeah, tools do matter.
And should we migrate a Flask project to FastAPI? All works well, but it will be outdated at some point?
It depends. If you are actively maintaining Flask projects and you try out FastAPI and you're like, oh wow, I like FastAPI so much more, then yeah, convert over. But if you're maintaining Flask projects and that makes you happy, and you try FastAPI and it doesn't give you that much more joy, or you don't need the async features that you can get by dropping Quark into Flask, that's a bit of work. If you, then don't switch. Or another thing is, let's say you have a Flask project that's been going for years and years and just works, and it doesn't really need maintenance except for, version updates now and then. Why fix what isn't broken? Why change what is completely functional? So upgrades are a tricky business. Version 2s are always challenging.
And how about the security performances of the three frameworks?
I would say they're all rather secure. Because of the whole thing of the cathedral and the cathedral and the bazaar, I think all of them have enough eyes on them from a security perspective that the frameworks themselves are good. Where I give Django and FastAPI the edge over Flask is just the absolute lack of mention of security or simple data validation in the documents. That it's sort of like, I don't want anyone to take offense in any direction, but in some ways Flask is like the PHP of Python web frameworks when it comes to security, just because anyone can jump in so fast, and because there's not much description of security, it's easy for people to make mistakes they might regret later.
Okay, thank you so much. And have you ever had to migrate between them?
Yes.
And how did that go? And that's the question. So any tip for when we did? So
the Flask projects I brought to FastAPI were, for those, it was really straightforward because I was essentially using Flask for microservices. So I wasn't changing like thousands of lines of code. It was basically like, oh, I've got a function, which is where the logic happens. I just move it from one framework to the other. What I have done or participated in was at the US version of Octopus Energy, we had to stand up a FastAPI service for a reason I can't discuss publicly, and it served a very good purpose. But now that enough time has eclipsed, the logic has been moved from FastAPI and into Django. And the reason why that was rather straightforward was because the business logic was encapsulated in functions. So it's just mostly a matter of moving the functions from one repo to another and moving tests that made sense. If you have something significant that you want to do, I suggest you read up on Sebastian Ramirez has a three-part article on converting a big Flask projects with lots of global objects, because Flask projects often end up with lots of globals, over to FastAPI, and that is absolutely worth a read, and he has a lot of lessons learned in there.
Thank you. And quite linked to your answer, domain-driven design introduces a very different project structure. Do you think Django and other frameworks should consider to give it guidance in project structuration?
I think I missed the first part of that.
Domain-driven design introduces a very different project structure. So should the documentation of this project should guide?
I mean, so with Django apps, you can, I mean, apps kind of are domains, sort of. So one of the things about domain-driven design is like any other architecture, it can make sense until it doesn't, and then it becomes a nightmare. Like, where's the division between account and profile and settings? And I've been in companies where that's been hotly debated. So I tend to be very careful about domain-driven design, just because I've seen it driven into the ground, and people, when you get religious about anything, it causes havoc. So yeah, I'm always try to pull back a little bit. I don't know if that answer makes any sense. If anyone wants to talk about domain-driven design, I'm happy to do it.
Okay, thank you. And last question, is it possible to combine FastAPI and Django in a single project? Or if not, what I should use to building API into a Django project? I guess apart from Django REST framework, which is of course
so you can import the Django RM into Flask API and serve it out. There's some gotchas though, so it's not something I really recommend anyone put anything life critical on it, like where people can die if something goes wrong. But there is a Django REST API library called Django Ninja, which copies a lot of the same patterns. There's another one called Hatch by Andrew Godwin. I don't know why he didn't just use Django Ninja. So there's libraries that ape the behavior of FastAPI, and I think that's awesome that we're seeing some cross-breeding between the frameworks. Because at the end of the day, we're all Python. We're all using Python to serve out HTTP.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for your insight.
So I asked this earlier, is there anyone here who, because I have these 3 plushies, what I'm looking for is parents of young children who had to leave their children behind, and they're thinking, what do I get for my kid? So anyone have someone under the, you sir, how old's your child?
I have 6 from 20 to 7.
Anyone else? Thank you. Hold on, I have 2 more of these that I can hand out. All right, so here, you're close. How old's yours?
2 years.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.